so I can just sit and chat. This is a nice crowd. I think the management thinks that it's rather small. Please don't think that at all. I think, this is fine. And if you want to come up, please do, because all the better. I don't know how much you know about the Caribbean and how much you know about Caribbean poetry. So I'm going to speak about my work in relation to the Caribbean sensibility, the Caribbean drive for self-expression. And I'll begin by saying that we are the area that some of you know as the tourist district, the posters, those blue posters that appear usually in midwinter, enticing you to go south. That's the Caribbean. But you have to disabuse yourself of any images of that kind of nirvana. It is not as, it is as beautiful as it looks, by all means, but it is as complex, if not more complex, than anything that you would be believing. It is, in other words, not really a poster or a brochure, but a very real part of the world. In fact, we are at the pivot of the Americas. If you think of your globe, your map, North America, South America, in that crack there, where Yucatan breaks off from north and south, where eventually I suppose there will be two continents floating in space, you have these islands that are in fact the broken fragments of the Andean chain. Also, in those islands, you have the dream of the fountain of youth, you have the Sargasso Sea, and you have lost Atlantis. Romantic in a way, but also part of a very real catastrophe that occurred in geological time. And that's what you have to bear in mind all the time. We are at the pivot of this remarkable double continent, and our history reflects that complexity. It is an area where originally there were Amerindian peoples, the Taino, the Carib, the Arawak, all those beautiful golden people that inhabited this double continent. And in 1492, Columbus discovered the islands for Europe, for Spain, and within 15 years, our 15 million Arawak people had been decimated, had been destroyed by the intrusion of not only of Spaniard and Dutch and English and French, but the intrusion of disease, influenza, pneumonia, syphilis, things that were unknown in that so-called paradise. Now today we only have about 15 or 20 true Amerindians surviving in the Caribbean, in the island of Dominica, and they are protected species. One has, very painful to say these things, but if they were not protected, I suppose they too would have disappeared. To replace these 15 million people, the Europeans first brought in their own laborers from Europe, the English, the French, the Dutch, whatever. But then because these people could not stand up to the type of tropical climate which is the Caribbean, and also because by the beginning of the 18th century, European powers were themselves developing an industrial society and therefore required to have manpower reserved in Europe. It was necessary to import a new form of labor. They had lost the original indigenous population, the chance of local labor, so you had the importation of the African. And into the Caribbean comes some 20 million Africans between 1640 and 1840, 200 years, a lot of people, half of them not even arriving in the Caribbean, but those that do bring in a new and remarkable culture into our region. So that really what you're looking at is Amerindian, European of many kinds, and African of many kinds, all, I wouldn't say fusing in the Caribbean, but all coming into some kind of creative fission in that archipelago, which is in itself a survival archipelago. That's what I want you to recognize. These fragments of islands, this curve of 3,000 miles from Florida right around to the Amazon, are really the tips of a sunken cordillera. And the people who have inherited that part of the world have also inherited that psyche, that strange appreciation of catastrophe and epiphany, the butterfly and the carcass, poverty and Byzantine-like wealth existing at the same time, black, white, mulatto, all of those paradoxes and attempted syntheses are part of our region. Here in the north, you are a little further away from that vortex, and therefore you try to see things a little simpler. You know, you see it in terms of black, white, rich, poor. You know, you attempt, at least as far as I can see, to draw starker contrast. That business of synthesis of what we call interculturation is not necessarily present here. And in South America, where the Amazon is a kind of strange maw absorbing everything, you have the opposite of contrast. You have the blurring of attention. But in the Caribbean, Antillean, maritime, archipelagic, we have this glitter and this paradox. Now, I myself come from the most paradoxical of all of those islands. The islands themselves are, as I said, the sunken tips of the volcanoes of the Andes. But Barbados, the island I come from, which is almost too small for you to notice on the map, I'm trying to expand the size to create an impression. We are 21 miles long at the longest 2 points, and 14 miles wide at the very widest, 144 square miles. That doesn't fit into Philadelphia, I suspect. 200,000 people living in Barbados, and another 2 million or so outside. But the thing about this island is that, unlike the rest of that chain which stretches from Florida to the Amazon, which is volcanic, Barbados is a coral island. So you have a difference there of light, of perception. Not that the Barbadians are any different, because we all inherit that Amerindian, that European, and that African ancestor. But because of the nature of the landscape, you have a different sensibility, which doesn't mean anything except that that is how it is. And the other thing about Barbados is, and I'm saying all this to give you an idea of the kind of poetry that you may hear, if I read any at all, that is. Because the way I've started now, it doesn't seem as if I might even get to that. But the thing about Barbados is that it's coral and not volcanic, and therefore there's a difference in light, and therefore a difference in the perception of metaphor, for those of you interested in poetry. See, there are two metaphors available, two basic metaphors available for the artists in the Caribbean: the leaf, the forest, the Amazon, and the air, and the stone, and the water. And the Barbadian has that lighter image, the blue rather than the green, for what that's worth, I can see. And the other thing about Barbados is that it is very British. It is colonial. We were colonized by the British, And you have New England, a bit north of you, and Barbados is known as Little England. Little England, an island of 200,000 people, most of which are black African. They're still known as Little Englanders, and we're very proud of it until recently. In fact, I think they're still proud of it. Famous stories of the Prime Minister of Barbados at the outbreak of the Second World War, sending a cable off to Winston Churchill. Carry on, Big England. Little England is behind you. That's because, you know, there was a high incidence of English settlement in Barbados, as there was in Bermuda. And it's similar in that point of view to, say, southern Africa, like Zimbabwe and so on. But although we are so English-oriented in terms of our educational system, we are still the nearest of all the islands to Africa. And on a very misty day, from the highest point of our island, the highest point only being 500 feet, we dream of seeing the coast of Guinea. So that in that one little landscape, we have both a European English education and a concept of form and of model. And at the same time, we have this surrealist attention and consciousness of the African continent, both ancestors living side by side in a way. And then, although we are very small, the island is very large because of the sea, the ocean, which is present in everyone's backyard. The island is so small that the sea is always present. Sometimes the sea appears below you, sometimes the sea appears above you. Sometimes the sea appears at eye level, sometimes the sea seems to be inside of your body itself. But we are people who the sea has made a great difference to. And this book, I try to have my books with the covers, communicating as clearly as possible. This mother poem, which is about Barbados, mother is my own mother and the island of Barbados. The publishers were able to get a blue background for that ocean I mentioned, and that is an early map of that ham-bone-shaped island, Coral, Barbados. Now, coming out of that island, how was I going to write my poetry? As I became conscious of the need to write, which I can't explain, but one has that need, like all poets anywhere. The problems that I faced were as follows. The educational system was Little Englandish. In our schools, it was a history of England. In fact, we had to learn the names of all the English kings. And we knew the names of Birmingham, Sheffield, Glasgow, but we didn't know the names of Caribbean cities like Kingston, St. John, Port of Spain. And our idea was that English, things British, things European were the correct way, the model that we would follow. This means that as I was growing up, I had to find models for writing, and it was English poets. Palgrave's Golden Treasury was one of the standbys in school. Ozymandias, Shelley, Keats, and Gray's Elegy, The Curfew Told Vanilla of Parting Day, and things like Tennyson, half a league onward, the charge of the Light Brigade, things like that. Now, that was what was going into us all the time. But then we were also learning from eccentrics, as we had to call them, people who were not in the school system, but who had messages which the society regarded as eccentric, the society rejected, but which some of us certainly listened to and found intriguing. Like, for instance, the old man who told me one day, when I was insisting that the standard of beauty must either be a Coca-Cola bottle or the paradigm of the Coca-Cola bottle, the Venus de Milo, he said, but what about the Sphinx? And that shattered me, right? The Sphinx. I never thought of that. That here's an alternative. I never knew that there was such a thing as an alternative until he said that. Now, he was a person who had not suffered the schools. He hadn't had to go through the education of the boys stood on the burning deck, and so was able to link up with another source of knowledge, which was part of us, but which we, as people educated in the British system, didn't have enough cognizance of. And then there were the folk songs, the folk tales, strange characters that we heard about on the moonlight nights, like Anansi, a spider who was also a man, and who I discovered later was also a god. And the notion of transformation came to me at this stage, without being conscious of it. I'm more conscious of it now. But the notion that a poem, a story, does not necessarily have to have a beginning, middle, and end. That is one way of writing. But there's also the notion of the transformation of the image, what you could call free association, using dream and vision in addition to ratiocination. That kind of thing came to us. So that this is what I had as my equipment, although by the time I left Barbados, I was still very British, very English. I was a man who understood the curfew tolls the knell of parting day. And like many West Indians, when I arrived in England, I really felt that I had come home. You know, things like Buckingham Palace, Nelson's Column, Trafalgar Square, Hyde Park. Some of us even asked on landing, where can I get to Sherwood Forest and see Robin Hood? You know, it was that kind of thing that was happening. We also had to leave the island because of its smallness and because of the nature of that small scale. For education, for higher education, when I was growing up, we didn't even have a University of the West Indies, which is now in full flower. To get a scholarship was a very important success, and to get a scholarship meant that the government gave one person a year enough money to travel to Cambridge in England or to Howard or to wherever you chose to study. Usually your parents expected you to become a doctor or a lawyer in order to make some money to lift everyone out one step higher. But the whole point is that it was a validation of the notion that what was beautiful and what was true was outside the island. Not even elsewhere in the region, you notice, but completely outside, 3,000-4,000 miles away in Britain, in Paris, in Toronto or New York. So I, like so many of us, made that journey from Barbados to England, and I had the experience for the first time of becoming aware of contrast, of things that I had not learned in my history books, that there was such a thing as consciousness of race, because we assumed that everyone was of the same race. Although there were white people in Barbados, we still regarded them somehow as Barbadians, but we didn't realize that people conceived of each other in terms of race, not a family, friend, street, but of race. And when I wrote my poems, for instance, in Cambridge University, I suffered that kind of problem. With a name like Brathwaite, this is a very, see again, Little England, Brathwaite is, or they say Braithwaite, very English name. And if I sent a poem by post to an editor, this was very comfortable. I was some guy from Scotland or the north of England who was writing a poem about snow. But if I turned up with the poem in my hand, he suffered a kind of mild stroke. Something was wrong. You see, here was this, this couldn't work. And as a result, it's a subjective thing. A lot of the poems just were not published. And what they told me was that, why don't you write poems about, some, they say about the jungle. I mean, as far as they were concerned, they come from the jungle, which is true. I mean, the Amazon is part of our thing. But what they were saying is that why do you write poetry that reflects the English environment, this environment, when you clearly look as if you should be writing poems that stem from King Kong or something like that. This, of course, upset me because I'd been taught that I was a citizen of the world and that poetry, above all things, is universal. So I couldn't understand how there could be these distinctions. But it really had a meaning to it. At least my generosity, I think, now sees that. What they were really saying is that before you become universal, you should really touch ground. You should start with your own thing. Even if in their view it was exotic, they felt that there should be I should have something to bring. I'm trying to interpret to them, right? You should have something that you could bring to the literature rather than being an imitation piece. This is what I was being, I suppose. So what I'm going to do is to show you a poem that I wrote when I went to Cambridge. And you'll see what they said. This is one that they published because they didn't know that it was from a West Indian. But it does contain my own very clear awareness of what was happening. It was the first time I saw snow. So it was one of those things that happened. And what the poem does, in addition to the description or an attempt to imitate the fall of snow, is my recognition of this stark difference between black and white. I was very conscious of that by this time. They perhaps did not recognize that part of it, but the core of the poem, which is divided into 4 stanzas, the 2 long line stanzas are the first and the last, and the 2 middle ones are where I'm making my protest or my statement of my outrage at racial metaphor. But this is what they heard. The day the first snow fell, I floated to my berth of feathers falling by my window, touched earth and melted, touched again and left a little touch of light, and everywhere we touched till earth was white. And now come the 2 stark stanzas. Wood was now black or white. White world was bright at night, and water was black wood carved into 2 white swans. Birth was black water where the white swans bend. Death was black water where the white wood ends. The day the first snow fell, I floated to my death of feathers falling by my window. Left love unmelted, loved again to touch the little left of light, but all the world was dark while earth was white. So that one went through. It was in all the anthologies and so on. But that, is this is a reaction of a colonial to his environment and becoming aware of the difficulties of being a poet in a black-white world. And then the second phase that came to me was the phase of looking out for people in Europe who I could empathize with. I didn't know them, but like all students, I went on the continent, I did my hitchhiking, and I remember being always struck by people I call other exiles. These are Europeans, Italians, Spaniards, and so on. But somehow I felt there was something in them that was not quite at home in their own environment, and so my sympathies went out to them. And in fact, I call this book Other Exiles because of that. And on the cover is a section of Gaudi's Cathedral Sacra, what's he called it now? The Sacred Mother, right? The cathedral in Barcelona. some of you might know this. Now, as far as I was concerned, you see, Gaudi was an exile. Gaudi is one of these eccentric artists who didn't finish his cathedral and whose work was so different from the prevailing norm that people look askance at him. And I'll read that poem now so you can see how I put myself in the cathedral if I didn't even put myself in Gaudi's place. That's the cathedral, Sacred Mother, unfinished in Barcelona. Also, what attracted me to this cathedral is, you see those spires there. At home on the beach, we made castles of sand, and the effect is very similar. So, there was all that to it. He dedicated to the city this horned and crawling church no other architect, he said, would have the fervor to attempt. And the committee, gazing short-sighted at the plans, had blessed the Sacred Mother. And twisting unicorn and spider patterns, he'd built this witty fever up 300 feet before he fell. His mother burnt the plans. No probes, she said, should ever see the pity of her son's last silly escapade. No other eyes should boggle at that final pagan paragon he dedicated to the city. The nervous, warped facade soon slowly fell. One little room remained intact, the crypt. Beneath the silly project dedicated to the city, with softer care than worms, he'd hollowed out a tiny sacristy lighted by yellow candles, and in a niche, this carver of great Gideon cathedral stones had cut a holy image of the bleeding Christ with agonizing thorns and wounds as glorious as flamingo flowers. He loved this holy image. Only his brother Judas knew how much. Who every Friday since his brother's death shutters and locks his bank, takes 30 shillings from the tally tank, crosses the road, climbs up the 100 dragon-haunted steps to the 3 empty archways of the Sacred Mother's incomplete facade, steps through one of the archways, not into singing aisles and transepts, but into the decaying, littered workyard. Here, like a ruined widow, every Friday evening he would pause, borrowing the desolation until he felt his body stripped and tattered into rags. He'd fumble for a candle stupidly, light it, descend into the crypt. There with his yellow candle, he'd suddenly delight the gloom and sorrow of his brother's holy image, and in the slotted box placed near the cross by the committee, funds for the preservation of the greater church, he'd drop his silver shillings in. The architect had loved this holy image. Only his watchful brother knew how much, who, irrevocable Good Friday afternoons ago, had pushed the builder from the scaffolding, so that he fell down the facade 300 feet to that quick cracking blow. His jealousy had urged and had tormented his pride so. And now he is the city banker, his name familiar on the stock exchange, and when he walks abroad he could afford to bloat and let his business prosper. But why did this small cancer gnaw at him? a prosperous betrayer in his guts. In this damp crypt on Friday evenings only, why did remorse find light to kneel and was itself annealed? But here he thanked his brother, clutched the good luck this chapel was complete, and genuflecting anxiously before the sacred sufferer, cupped his fat hands around the instep where the holy nails had festered out into a glorious sore, and sinking his head lower, reached its serenest core. This was the 13th wonder. The people of the city would never know another. That's Barcelona, right? So I wrote, that was the kind of poetry. It's marginal in the sense that the people that I am looking at, the people that I'm relating to, are not the princes and the potentates of that culture, but these eccentrics. But it's a reflection of my state of perception at that time. And then it was time, inevitably, to finish with the University of Cambridge. I wanted to stay there because it was like a kind of home. I had become adjusted to it. And I began to find this second phase of rejection. Couldn't get a job. The English wanted to know why I didn't want to go back home. Why don't you go home, they said. Now, they didn't know that I had conceived of myself, thanks to their own education, which had, a citizen of the world, a poet, and it was the custom at that time for Caribbean poets to live in the metropolis. But there were novelists, George Lamming, Naipaul, Salki, Jan Carew, some of these names no doubt in the library, some of these books I hope in your shop here, names that you might know. The Caribbean literature begins not in the Caribbean, but in London, part of that same paradox I'm speaking of. But these were novelists. Novelists apparently are easier to publish and easier for the publisher to make some money out of. Poets, no. Why don't you go back home? Now for me, home had been, as I have tried to describe it just now, full of paradox, contradiction, materialist, very shallow soil, not supportive of the muse. This is how I was taught to think this way. I felt that poetry should be where Thomas Gray was buried. And there was I in Cambridge in a room looking across at Thomas Gray's grave. So you can see how I felt, I mean, my college, Edmund Spencer was there. Ted Hughes was a friend of mine, at the same college in Cambridge. So, and this is where the action should have been. But the English didn't think I should get a job. I was willing to do anything, but somehow they said, why don't you go home? And I didn't. So I said, well, since home is Philistine and I don't wish to go, now where else can I travel to? Where else can I go to keep away from this Philistine Caribbean situation? And I started the thing that all of you have done at some stage, opened the newspaper, wanted ads, jobs, employment. This is the Times educational supplement, and I saw jobs, Jerusalem, monastery, work for free in the monastery. I don't know doing what, but I went to the appointment. At least, the man looked at me and said, he didn't think I was Christian enough. Saudi Arabia, do you drink? I didn't know that, you're not supposed to drink in Muslim countries. And I don't drink very much, but I thought I would, be very manly about this. Oh yes, said I. The man paid me my fare back to Cambridge. Ceylon, tea plantation. What do you know about tea? And so it went on. And until one day, quite by accident, someone said, why don't you go to Ghana? Now Barbados, as I said, is the nearest of the Caribbean islands to Africa. But because of our education, we knew nothing about Africa, right? As I said, Robin Hood, King Alfred and the Cakes, Queen Boadicea, Queen Elizabeth, those were the icons that I had close to me. Ghana I didn't know about. Perhaps in our books, in our history books, history, we never saw anything about Africa. As far as the history books were concerned, Barbados had no people. I remember I told you that we had Amerindians. The history book said that Barbados was discovered by the Portuguese in 1520, and the island was inhabited by wild pigs, or hogs as they call them, which were soon destroyed by the hungry sailors. And then finally, that was an abortive settlement. In the year 1604 or 1612, they're not quite certain, English settlers landed and claimed the island for King James I. They don't mention that they had to import Africans as slaves. That is missing from the history books written at the time. And we moved from the year 1620 to the year 1937, when there was a riot in Barbados for some reason which is unexplained. And soon, happily, we have independence and everyone is living happily ever after. So that there was nothing in my background, right, to prepare me for Africa. Or should I say, the only thing in my background that would have prepared me for Africa is what my old school teacher asked me when I came back from Africa. In a room like this, I gave a long, grueling talk about my experiences in Africa, trying to explain that my mother was right, that my friend who told me about the Sphinx was right, and I sweated that day in this room. And my teacher got up afterwards, and after I'd finished my 2-hour marathon, her little voice at the back of the room, with all these young youths, the children there listening and glistening, he said, "Does Tarzan still live there? Does Tarzan still live there?" You see, the image of Africa, even for us, was of the comic strip. This remarkable falsity. So perhaps this is what I thought too, I don't know. Certainly I didn't have any preconceived ideas about Africa. So when I went there, I went in order to get a job and to be away from the Caribbean, away from the Philistine context. And that is very important. That is the most important thing that happened to me. Because unlike people like Richard Wright, for instance, if you know his book Black Power, and many of us who we go with this sense of mission. You go there to find your roots, you go there to make a connection, or you go to be a missionary. I just went as a man getting a job. I'm glad to get it. I went as an education officer, and they asked me to inspect primary schools. I had to go out into what they call the bush, where there was no electricity, no toilet facilities, where to cross the river. Some village youth would put you on his back and you would go across, where the germ theory had not yet reached, things like that. And that made all the difference. I didn't know it then, but I had started my de-education. Because to really write, I had really to remove King Alfred and the Cakes, and I had to remove that whole the pentameter. Pentameter was the thing standing between myself and reality. So that was the Ghanaian part of the experience. And I'd like to read for you a poem that I wrote now, which describes my feeling, not necessarily at that moment, but on reflection. One makes many journeys back to the ancestor. My recognition that something important was happening to me. The kind of welcome I got in Ghana, in West Africa, is not the kind of welcome I got in Cambridge. Cambridge is very full of books and full of the concept of poetry, but at no time did anyone say welcome. What they said is, when are you going back home? Two different things. And it was this welcome, which I had never received before, which began to make me understand that there's such a thing as a community, there's such a thing as group, family. What I began to recognize is that all of those things that I had been despising in my head from Barbados, through my ignorance, were here in Africa. In other words, forms that I had left behind, ignorant of, family forms, speech patterns, dance movements, religious concepts, which we had been told meant nothing because the schools did not admire these things, I began to recognize were here. And this is where, after the de-education, begins that journey, not only into Africa, but really back to the Caribbean. Takoradi, the seaport town of Ghana. It's a modern port, but modern doesn't really mean very much. It just happens to be there. But it's the people in there, when I land at the port, compared to when I land in England or anywhere else, you've got this sense of recognition. Takoradi was hot. Green struggled through red as we landed. Laterite lanes drifted off into dust, into silence. Mummies crowded with cloths flowered and laughed. White teeth, smooth voices like pebbles, moved by the sea of their language. Akwaba they smiled, meaning welcome. Akwaba they called Aiko. Well, have you walked? Have you journeyed? Welcome. You who have come back a stranger after 300 years, welcome. Here is a stool for you. Sit. Do you remember? Here is water. Dip. Wash your hands. Are you ready to eat? Here is plantain. Here palm oil. Red, staining the fingers, good for the heat, for the sweat. Do you remember? And of course, I could not remember at that moment, because what intervened here now for me was this idea, this reality and myth that these people who were asking me to sit and eat had also sold us into slavery. You know, that there is that there too. You know, the whole idea is your great 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 grandfather also your, you know, your auctioneer? Very false, but it is one of those things that when the books do begin to describe it, that is the first thing you hear, that, you know, your African ancestors are your enemies. And it has caused a lot of conflict between African and New World black people. So intervening comes this image of the slave trade. I tossed my net, but the net caught no fish. I dipped to wish, but the well was dry. Beware, beware, beware. I traveled to a distant tongue. I could not find my mother. I could not find my father. I could not hear the drum. Whose ancestor am I? Whose ancestor am I? I walked in the bush, but my cutlass cut no path. Returned from the farm, but could not hear my children laugh. Beware, beware, beware. And so the poem develops that caution until I begin to move slowly further and further into the country along that red laterite path until I come to the center of the culture, Kumasi, where certain things begin to happen. And the whole process of return begins at the furthest point that I move into the African continent. It is at that moment that I also begin a return to the Caribbean. And I can remember, it's amazing how you have biographical, autobiographical moments, signposts for these things. There are two things that happened. When I got to Kumasi, which is the capital of the Ashanti people, I was with a Jamaican friend and we wanted to visit the Asante, the king of the Asante. You know, that was a big thing. We had really traveled a long way. We did not come on foot, but somehow I felt we had walked a long way. and we wanted to meet just to see the Santahini. And I remember going into the palace and speaking to the Ochiami and explaining what we wanted, and everything was fine until he said, "Where do you come from, my brothers?" And we said, "From the West Indies." And there was one of those little silences, and he said, "I'm not sure that the Santahini will be able to see you as West Indian." So we said, "Why is this?" He said, "Well, you see, in 1890, the British brought the West India Regiment to this country, made up of West Indians, and the West India Regiment was instrumental in defeating the armies of the Santahini and having the Santahini deported from his own sole land to St. Helena, or one of the islands. And as a result of that, there is an oath sworn here that the Santahini will never speak, will never break bread with a cane sucker, as they call West Indians in their language. That was the first time I had heard that, and that was an important revelation, right? That you see, the history. People could feel so strongly about their culture. That was the point. That this action of the West India Regiment could create an oath which the Santahini to this day observes. I had no idea of customs and culture until that moment. That was the important thing there. Second important little thing that happened to me was the first day I decided to entertain some of my Ghanaian friends to breakfast. I invited them to breakfast, bachelor on my own, had this cook, and I put on this big breakfast that I thought would impress, that was bacon, eggs, cornflakes. And they, the wrinkling of the nose, to my horror, it was a reaction against this food. And they said, we don't like cornflakes. And it just blew my mind. I could not believe that anyone in the world could not like cornflakes. And they said, they said, well, they're again, that word came in, they're alternatives too. You don't have to eat cornflakes. That is Western food. That is brony food, right? And that little thing made me realize there are differences, and the difference is you become what you eat. No wonder they could not see me as what I would have liked to be seen as. I was a man eating cornflakes. No matter what I wanted to be, I was a cornflake eater, cane sucker, right? And then I got my first dose of malaria. Again, I thought I was immune, you see. I was there for 9 years, and somehow for about 7 of those years I survived. The mosquitoes used to feast around me and nothing happened. And finally, the malaria came. And I was living at this time about 40 miles from Kumasi along the Volta River. And by this time, I had been very privileged to really get into that culture. Because of my position as an education officer and not as a university lecturer or anything, I was meeting, I was really seeing things. And the more I began to recognize, the more I became familiar and easy with the culture, the more I recognized Barbados. That was what was happening all the time. I was making this connection between Barbados and Ghana. And the notion, home, began to mean something for the first time. That home that I had rejected in order to go to England and to travel and all this, it began to mean something. Home now began to have a meaning. And I recognized that it did not have to be a home away from home, but home could be back home. Home could be where I came from, where I started from. And this is the poem that I wrote with this malaria, the miasma, because in the delirium of the fever, you see, another thing I have to say, this is ocean people. Anytime there's a crisis in my mind, I have to get back to that seashore, pebbles, water, glisten, right? Those images. And this fever created that desire in me. It was not a desire at first to get to the Caribbean. It was a desire to get to the seashore at Accra, 300 miles south along the river. I wanted just to get by this beach. But as this fever, as this fantasy, as whatever was going on happened, I did not stop at the seashore of Ghana. I traveled on across that middle passage back to the Caribbean for the first time in about 14 years, I suppose. For the first time, I was able to travel back home itself and not anywhere else. And I realized then that I could, in fact, physically return as well. Now let me read that poem called South, which, these are the landmarks. And then I will discuss what happened when I did get home. See if I can find that now. Trouble with writing these long books of poems is that for me, at any rate, I can never find my way in them. Hold on. Let me get my little secret. Now you see, at some of these readings, people know so well the books that they usually shout out and tell me page, whatever it is, but no one has done that yet. And I can't even find my notes now. No, here they are. South. South is on page 57. South. Right. But today I remember, today I recapture the island's bright beaches. Blue mist from the ocean rolling into the fishermen's houses. By these shores I was born. Sound of the sea came in at my window. Life heaved and breathed in me then with the strength of that turbulent soil. Since then I have traveled, moved far from the beaches, sojourned in stony cities, walking the lands of the north in sharp slanting sleet and the hail, crossed countless saltless savannas, and come to this house in the forest where the shadows oppress me, and the only water is rain and the tepid taste of the river. We who are born of the ocean can never seek solace in rivers. Their flowing runs on like our longing, reproves us our lack of endeavor and purpose, proves that our striving will founder on that. We resent them this wisdom, this freedom, passing us toiling, waiting and watching their cunning declension down to the sea. But today I would join you, traveling river, borne down the years of your patientest flowing, past pains that would wreck us, sorrows arrest us, hatred that washes us up on the flats, and moving on through the plains that receive us, processioned in tumult, come to the sea. Bright waves splash up from the rocks to refresh us. Blue seashells shift in their wake, and there is the thatch of the fishermen's houses, the path made of pebbles, and look, small urchins combing the beaches look up from their traps to salute us. They remember us just as we left them. The fisherman, hawking the surf on this side of the reef, stands up in his boat and halloos us. A starfish lies in its pool, and gulls White sails slanted seaward, fly into the limitless morning before us. That's the dream. And I return soon after that. But listen to the paradox that still persists. But I return to find Jack Kennedy invading Cuba. Black riots in Aruba and Trinidad refusing thirsty U.S. Marines water. For selfishness when young played on the floor with soldiers. The mind's Napoleons with dirty hands. And selfishness, no longer young, still on the floor with soldiers. But now our island's leaders, clever cut democracy of laymen, preachers, lawyers, pupil teachers, typists, skilled hospital porters, each in his Walter Mitty world a wild Napoleon with dirty hands, each blind to that harsh light and vision that had once consumed them, eager now, ambitious, anxious that their single-minded fame should rise up uncorrupted from the foundry flames of times and blemished brasses, while the supporting poor, famished upon their simple politics of fish and broken bread, begin to catch their royal asses, denuded into silence like the stones where their shacks sit, where their picks hit, where beaten spirits, trapped in flesh, litter the landscape with their broken homes. So you see, you come back, the circle is almost complete, and you find that the battle has to be started all over again on a different level. The metaphor has been captured, but the politics, the social realities now have to be taken care of. Because although I had made that journey, the people of the Caribbean had been where that fisherman had always been. They had not really traveled that journey, so it was still Little England that I would now have to cope with, and my problem would be how to write poetry in the Caribbean, how to write poetry in that, what I now call that so-called Philistine atmosphere, but which still in reality does not nourish the poet, does not nourish that kind of expression. That is the problem that one had to face now. But the difference is that it is now being faced in the Caribbean, creatively intimate with my own people, rather than waging a battle 3,000 miles away in Europe, in England. That is the big difference between the two. Now, as that develops, one thing that does happen is that you learn how to use the resources of the landscape, of the manscape even, in a way that you could never do if you were living outside of it. Right? The first thing is how to break out of that pentameter which I mentioned, and then having broken out, how to use the sung patterns, the history, the mythology, the living reality of the islands to forge a literature, to forge a poetry, a literature which becomes indigenous, which becomes a true literature, which is no longer colonial and imitative. That is what is happening in the Caribbean right now. And I'll give you an example of how, in my case, I attempt to break out of that pentametric model, and various devices and resources that I use. The first one is the use of music. That goes without saying. Pentameter, the tum, it has a lot of problems. It is very seductive. It is, basic. I mean, no one gets away writing poetry for very long without it. Whitman tried, those long lines. using the speaking voice and all that. But somehow the, it is such a strong model, it is such a prism really, that you tend to come back to it, especially at moments of poetic crisis. And the critics tend to push, they push it at you, where's your sonnet, where's your form? But the danger with that, and of course we use it, you should use it, after all it's part of the inheritance, it's part of the universality. But, you see, in the tropics, it is not only a curfew tolling a bell, there are other features as well. When Thomas Gray's contemporaries wrote about the Caribbean, about slavery, he imported nymphs and satyrs into the Caribbean. And instead of showing a slave woman suffering from the toils of labor and from the brutal whipping that she would have, he had them sporting the light fantastic, Venus rising from the sea. Black Venus, it is true, but Venus, nymph and satyr, lost and fair. This kind of thing happened, and it is inherited. So one day I was walking along the seashore again, as always, and let me tell you the first time it happened. It was over the business of putting on, in the Caribbean, a production of Othello. Simple, you would think, Othello. And the great producer of the Jamaican theatre company said he was having difficulties because he could not find an Othello. Population of 1.5 million, couldn't find Othello. And all these, So that was my point. I said, are you looking, what are you looking for? He was really looking for Laurence Olivier, see? And I said, well, why not use, Bongo? Why not use a man? But of course they weren't trained and this, that, and the other. So Othello was never produced, which was either good or bad. But the second thing that happened now, that was my first move to say, well, why not use local resources? The second thing is how to write a West Indian poetry that does not rely monopolistically on the pentameter. And along the beach, I'm skidding a stone, which all of you, I'm always never sure if you skid stones, I know you have beaches, but I never know if the beaches have pebbles, unless you go to some out-of-the-way place, because the beaches that, because of the kind of society, everybody goes to the same beach kind of thing, and they seem to have the beach cleaned and all that. But there are pebbles on beaches, they come from the sea, especially if you're in a coral situation, and these pebbles are there, and we walk along the beach days before the computer and video game, and the whole idea is who can skid this pebble for the longest set of skips along the water. So we always skid these pebbles along the beach. And one day it occurred to me, the archipelago that we have, that whole curve of islands, each island is a little skip, is created by God. When he did that, he skidded a stone along the water and created the curve. That's okay. But then I said, God must also have had at that moment some rhythm, some sense of rhythm and song that went along with it. And it was not the pentameter. It could not have been ta-tum, ta-tum. It couldn't be. You see, that way the Caribbean is shaped, it couldn't be. The islands don't look that way. There was some other thing there. So I said, there must be another rhythm that God would have available to him. And this is what happened when it all came together like this. The stone had skidded, arced and bloomed into islands, Cuba, San Domingo, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Grenada, Guadalupe, Bonaire. Curved stone hissed into reef, wave, teeth fanged into clay, white splash flashed into spray, Bathsheba, Montego Bay, bloom of the arcing summers. That's the calypso. And that's the beginning of it. Because I said, calypso is an ancient form we have. It's always been there. The most popular artists are the Calypsonians and now the reggae, Bob Marley, Sparrow. You know, why is it that the poetry has to be so divorced from the other thing? There they are. So I said yes, there's that, the calypso. And then after that, there were so many other rhythms available for use, you know, so that in moments of crisis, I found I could turn to those things in the same way that our people turn to those things when they are under stress as well. For instance, there is the bambula, the carnival rhythm, the rhythm that comes out of the limbo. I don't know if you have heard of the limbo. Again, it returns to the tourists. The limbo is a dance which is now relegated to the nightclubs of the Caribbean. I see some smiles here. Does it mean that you have seen these dances in the nightclub, in those settings? Good, I am glad. That makes sense. You see, the limbo is a very important dance. Relegated. Dum 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 ba dum dum bum 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 ba dum bum. That is the basic rhythm. It gives us a cutaway from the pentameter as well. But in working on, in writing the poem, this one I'm going to read, at least, you know, other things now happen to show you the importance of rhythm. The rhythm led me to understanding of the limbo, because it has a meaning, it is a vestige, it is an omen. It is preserved in the nightclub, not relegated there. And it has a meaning, which in writing the poem, I was led to. And this has happened in many other occasions, which is, we call that possession. That is free association, or rather, the following of an image and metaphor until you come to areas of knowledge that you were not aware you had within you. Right? And the pentameter, as I said, doesn't do that. It leads you to gray, but it doesn't lead you to this thing. Now, that limbo, as you know, is in the nightclubs. You have a stick. You would have seen it as a stick. Sometimes they set fire to the stick, more dramatic. But there's a stick, and you have usually a male, two females, two Vestal virgins usually dance around. But there's this athletic male whose job it is to dance backward, his body thrown back under the stick. He starts off with the stick usually. Sometimes he has the stick taller than him. But every time he successfully goes under the stick, it is lowered until finally the stick is on the level with his navel, and he goes under it. And finally the stick is practically touching the ground, and still he goes under that stick. Now, there's a meaning, you see, which the poem leads to, and it is this. What is happening, what it is telling us, and it is part of the paradox that it is in the nightclub. That stick is the deck of the slave ship. And every lowering of the stick is a filling up of that slave ship, where those 50 million, those 20 million, those myriads of Africans who were brought over in the slave ship were packed in that sardine-like manner below deck. The deck of the ship becomes the top of that stick, and they were placed in that position, lying cramped on their backs, one on top of the other, in the same way that the dancer plays himself for you in the nightclub, right? It is a psychodrama, if you like, a reenactment in order to preserve sanity of that middle passage experience. The deck of the ship is the limbo stick. Limbo itself means not only limbo in European terms of something in between, which is what you might, the first thing you might think, is also the Congolese limbe, meaning a threshold, an opening, and is connected with water and connected with fire. So when they put fire on the stick, they are repeating a very ancient ritual, and the music itself is the water music. What is happening there is that it is not simply a dance celebrating licentiousness or athletic prowess or even celebrating the passage on the slave ship, but it is demonstrating to everyone who has eyes to hear that there is a resurrection quality in the experience. Because not only does the athlete, the dancer, go under the stick, but he rises up on the other side in an equally remarkable manner. In fact, even more remarkable than he goes under. Because to rise from that position of lying on your back with your knees spread west and east, and to come up like that towards the son of the drum, that is a miracle. And that is what the dance is saying. You see, many of us in the Caribbean still don't know this, but the moment we recognize it, there is a transformation in our psyche. A lot of that self-contempt is removed as soon as that connection is made, and it is made as soon as you say it. It's one of those things when people say, of course, that's what it means. It was always there, like Alex Haley saying that those words that his family preserved, they were always there, signposting back to a wider nexus of information. Ban, ban, Cali, ban, like to play pan at the carnival, prancing up to the limbo silence, dung, 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 so the god went drum him, dung, 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 to the island town. Dung, 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 and the darkness falling, eyes shut tight and the wit like crawling, wrung the ship where his freedom drowned, dung, 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 to the island town. Ban, ban, Cali, ban, like to play pan at the carnival, dipping down and the black god's calling, back he falls to the water's cries, dung, 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 where the music hides him, dung, 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 where the silence hides. Limbo, limbo, limbo like me, limbo, limbo like me, limbo, limbo, limbo like me, limbo, limbo like me. And so the poem will develop or can develop. That's another example of some of the things. Now, the most difficult area is that of possession, which I will not go into on this occasion because that is very sacred and very difficult. But the leading of this limbo, the same way that the metaphor leads to knowledge, it is also possible for other states to be reenacted where one attempts as a poet to record experiences similar to that of the priest within the Hunfor, the priest within the religious experience. And it is not easy, it is not, but it is possible there, so that eventually the poetry leads you to, in the same way that this poem led me to an understanding of the limbo. Another thing happened as a result of metaphor, creating another connection which the scribes and Pharisees said did not exist. Having returned to the Caribbean, I was very aware that I had traveled with Africa. That's the first thing. It was no longer a lonely, unique experience. I was traveling now with a culture that I was related to, a culture that had welcomed me and which I could trace ancestral connections with. And then one day in St. Lucia, in October, I was standing on a hill and I was aware of a mist coming across the ocean and a dry feeling on my skin, right? Now, I remember in Africa that one of the big things from about May, June, July, Easter time, is what they call the harmattan, when the sea, the ocean of the Sahara begins to move off the Sahara westward, and it cracks the furniture, it brings blood to your nose, it blooms the trees and everything. Harmattan is a key item. What I said is, you know what? Our climate here, our flowers, our blossoming time, our sunsets, the whole business of our dry season, the season at which the slaves came from Africa, in fact, is not meteorologically connected with anything in North America or the Gulf Stream drift or anything. We are dealing really with another omen from Africa. The connection is there. The Sahara, the winds of the Sahara are blowing straight across, quite right, because there is a westerly wind, and it is affecting the climate of the Caribbean and affecting the history of the Caribbean, because it is the time when that migration took place. The prevailing wind brings the slaves, and they bring the slaves in the dry season when it is most apt that they can be brought. I told people about this, meteorologists, and they laughed. Oh, nonsense, foolishness, this is impossible. So I said, all the elements are here. Why is it that it cannot be? It is not that they had a counter-argument. They just said, weather is created in North America. That is a paraphrase of what they... Weather is created in North America. I said, if you go on with this foolishness, you will never be able to predict a hurricane. Because if you have to depend upon resources from Miami telling you what is happening in the Great Lakes, and you're not going to have a complete picture of weather, and therefore your predictions are going to be wrong. And wrong predictions in the Caribbean are absolutely fatal, because with those precipitous islands, one drop of rain falling becomes a flood. It's not just a drop falling and sinking. The drop of rain falls and rushes down a 3-mile hill slope, and by the time it comes onto the plains, it is an avalanche, meeting paper houses. So it is important to have accurate prediction. And without the African dimension, prediction is impossible. It is only when there was a freak in 1972, there was a freak took place, that the Sahara turned north, and over London, Paris, there was this red cloud, and all the meteorologists that sent their balloons up discovered it was dust from the Sahara, right? Because their balloons brought back evidence that, and then they worked it out. Of course, there are stratospheric winds that travel and do that. Then everybody said, okay, if it goes to Europe, it is possible that it can come across to the Caribbean, right? But it is those revelations are a result of the metaphor of the poem, if you see what I'm getting at. What I'm trying to say here is that as soon as one discovers the freedom of the image can also lead to knowledge which may have been resident, but which was not articulated until you needed that connection. That is the kind of thing that is happening here. But instead of going into that, I want to now move very briefly onto another area, equally important, which deals with what we call nation language. That is introducing into the poetry the language of the people. Again, moving out of the pentameter and introducing the dramatic monologue or dialogue and the speech patterns of the people themselves. Now, when these sisters leave like that, you leave me with very little, I mean, here some poems were coming for you. I know you have to go, it's all right. Oh, good, yes, right. Don't be swayed by what I say. Now here is the nation language. Now again, this was a matter of a lot of dispute, because it was said that, you can only write poetry in standard English. That's one of the theories we have. And it was not until the poem was written and performed that the skeptics were silenced. Very sad. The first great nation language poet is Louise Bennett. You may have heard of her. Very fine performer of her work. Louise Bennett started writing in the 20s and the 30s. And in 1962, there was the anthology, Independence Anthology of Jamaican Literature. And Louise Bennett appears in that anthology, but she does not appear in the poetry. they hover at the back of the book under a section called miscellaneous. And it is this miscellaneous that I am trying to make more central into this thing. Here is a story about cricket. That is why, you have to stay, because cricket you might know. Baseball is your game, which is a derivation of cricket. So I find that if I read it, you might understand. It's the same kind of excitement. Cricket is much more complicated. It's an English game, another thing. But the way it's played in the Caribbean, it is no longer English. It is again an erosion of the pentameter. Let us say that the English cricketers play cricket in the pentameter. We play it in the kaiso or the calypso. But above all, it is the only time that we can defeat the superpower. Very important, the colonial, the little David, we can beat them at cricket. We can't beat them in the Malvinas, and we can't. But on the cricket field, it is possible and happens very often, and it is a moment of great catharsis. Victory or defeat. One is triumph and one is tragedy. Schools close for the day. If there is cricket and if there's a victory, they get the second day to celebrate. If it is a defeat, they stay in and have detention, and teachers beat them more mercilessly than ever. So here is a game of cricket, and it starts again outside where I live. You see, where I live, where I was born, the sea, I can't really describe how that sea influences the sea. Before I was born, my mother says the sea was like where my bed is, and it moves, it goes, it has that rhythm over time. It either goes a little further out of time, but it's always there. From my window, we sit at a table, and through the door is the sea. Sound of the sea, the light of the water on the wall of the house. So everything is connected with that experience. On the beach, they play beach cricket and dream of the big cricket, the big league, similar to your, whatever you call it, Giants versus whatever. And here's the nation language. Many a time I have seen him saving the side, the tailor was saying as he sat and sewed in his shop. You remember that tourney with Brandon? What he named now, that big able water policeman, the one in charge of the harbor patrol? You mean Hopalong Cass. It's because a cow give his mother a kick before he did born that he foot come out so. Yes, I know, but it's not what I'm talking about. Old Hoppy was bowling that day as if he was Hurricane Father. Lambert went in, playing, he know all about it as usual, and swoosh, there he go fanning outside the off stump, and his click, he snicked the ball straight into the slips. Well, boys, it looked like we lost in this match, says the skipper, writing note in the exercise book he was keeping the scoring. You think we could chance it and send Gullstone in before Charlie or Spooks? So Gullstone went in. You could see his face whitening under his tan, and you know that Saiga boy frightened. Back tapping, feet walking about like they're talking with ants. Had was to stop myself asking myself if he ever played cricket on Browns Beach before. And I told him over and over again, watch the ball, man. Watch the ball like it hooked to your eye when you first goes in and you don't know the pitch. I don't mean to poke, but you just got to watch what you're doing. This isn't no time for playing the fool nor making no sport. This is cricket. But Gullstone too deaf. Mother don't clean out the wax in the air. First ball from Cass and the fishing, second ball in the missing, swishing the bat like he wishing to catch butterfly. Though the all Gullstone could ever catch on this beach was a coal, but it's always the trouble with we too afraid and too frightened. It's all very well when it's rosy and sweet, but lemmer the start, and burgalung dung, you can't find a man to hold it beside. Look what happened last week at the Oval. At the Oval? What happened last week at the Oval? You mean to say that you come in here with that line skin cone, you're calling a hat on your head, and them slip slop shoes strap on your foot like a tourist. You sprawl your ass over all my chair without asking me, please leave no license. Wasting my time, you know very well I can't find enough to finish these suits before Christmas. And on top of all this, you could wind up the nerve to stop me cool in the middle of all my needle and thread, make me prick my hand in my haste, and tell me broad and bold to my face that you don't really know what happened at Kensington Oval? We was only playing the MCC, man. MCC, who come all the way out from England. We was batting, you see. Score wasn't too bad. 197 for 3. The openers out, Ty Worrell out. Everton Weeks just glide 2 for 50. And Jack the Giant to come. Fella named Wardle was bowling, tossing it up, sweet, slow, medium, sir. You see, we bowl overhand, whereas you pelt, as we would say. First ball, no, back down the wicket to Wardle. Second ball, no, back down the wicket to Wardle. Third ball coming up, and we know what's going to happen to Syrup. Clyde back, funny back foot, and cracks is through extra cover, and 4 red runs all the way. You see that shot? The people were shouting. Jesus Christ, man, wanna see that shot? All over the ground, fellas shaking hands with each other, as if it was they wheeling the willow, as if it was them had the power. One man ran out from the field with a red full cock going quack, quack, quack in his hand, would give it to Clyde right then and right there if the police didn't stop him. And in front of where he was sitting, one bald-headed skeptic snatched hat off his head as if he did crazy, and pointing his finger at Wardle, he jump up and down like a sun-shattered daisy and bawl out, "Blood, big boy, bring me he blood!" Who would have think that for 25 years he was standing up there in them post office cages licking glory on government stamps? If I wasn't there to see for myself, I would have never believed it. I would have never believed it. But I say it once and I say it again. When things going good, you can't stop we. But lemmer the start, an old man, you can't find a man to hold up himself. And that's how that developed. Now the last one, because you see I'm here thinking that you stop at 10, when in fact I've gone on now for God knows how long. But you see, I'm dealing with 5,000 years of history, 2,000 miles of archipelago, and God knows how many zodiacs of my own imagination. So, these things happen. But you've been very patient. Now, the thing that links it all together in a way is the experience of Africa, the formal, the Europe, the language is European as well as African as well as Caribbean, so that we restore in a way those ancestral icons that were there at the beginning, and we try to have the ability to move from one regime to the other. We feel that instead of having only a false image, say, of Europe, we try to get a true image of ourselves, and through that image of ourselves, we can then relate to these other continents, these other continental cultures in a much easier way. And the poetry itself becomes more flexible, as you tried to point out to you here. So in celebration of that, I'll just return to what happened in Ghana and what is also happening in the Caribbean with the new rhythms that are burgeoning forth. I already gave you an idea of the carnival rhythm. Here is the rhythm of the drum, and that miraculous atumpan drum, which is able to speak at the same time that it sounds, that says things at the same time that it sings, that integrates, in other words, all the elements that go up to make a poem. God is dumb until the drum speaks. The drum is dumb until the gong gong leads it. Man-made, the gong-gongs, iron eyes of music walk us through the humble dead to meet the dumb, blind drum where Odamankoma speaks. Kong, 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 kong. Kum, 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 kum. Funtumi Akori, Twenibo Akori, Twenibo Kodia, Kodia Tweniduru, Odomonkoma Charimase, Odomonkoma Charimase, Oko Babia, Wamani Ho Meni So, Wamani Ho Meni So, Okoko Bonapa, Okoko Tuobon, Ahima Hima Hima, Ahima Hima Hima, Funtumi Akori, Twenibo Akori, Spirit of the Cedar, Spirit of the Cedar Tree, Twenibo Kodia, Odomonkoma Charimase, Odomonkoma Charimase, the great drummer of Odomonkoma says, the great drummer of Odomonkoma says that he has come from sleep, that he has come from sleep and is arising like a cohota cock, like a cohota cock who clucks, who crows in the morning. We are addressing you, Yere Chariwo. We are addressing you, Yere Chariwo. Listen, let us succeed. Listen, may we succeed. Good.
You had more time, but that's all right.
Yes, because I can talk to you.
After such a reading, I don't know that there is anything I can say that wouldn't be anticlimactic. But I have to. As they say, throw in, a word from the sponsor. Those of you who are addicted to